these last days, uncharacteristically, a statement has been made. And that statement is that it is not possible to understand the nature of emptiness, nor to arrive at what we might call the gateless gate, until and unless we embrace and are embraced by the three levels of existence: existence, knowledge, and bliss, called Satchitananda, or the ocean of oneness. Now, this ocean of oneness is that place where these three levels of life, that nitty-gritty level of cause and effect, that level of magic and intuition, the occult, and that level of interrelatedness become seamless for us. Now, the Sufis have mastered the art of putting together in allegories, folk tales and fairy tales what it is that occurs when these three come together in our life. So let's see what this rather long allegorical folk story of a Sufi kind evokes for us in relation to this awareness that we're endeavoring to understand, to arrive at an understanding of the nature of emptiness, or the gateless gate. There was a king who had 3 sons, handsome fellows, trained in the ways of the court, in all those attributes that were necessary to make them potential kings. But this king had a garden, and he prided himself on this garden. It was filled with every kind of fragrant bloom that was obtainable in the world at that time. And amongst those blooms there was one particular exotic flower that had a fragrance and a beauty that surpassed all the others. And the king prided himself on this amazing bloom. But one day when the king was out in his garden, he noticed that one of the blossoms had been picked from its bush. And he wondered what had happened. The next day, when he went out, there was another blossom taken from the bush. So he called his 3 sons to him and said that he wanted them to have a vigil to find out what it was that was coming in the dead of night to steal these exotic blossoms. So the eldest of the sons had his servants erect a tent, put cushions around to make him comfortable for the night, and he went out to keep vigil. But, of course, in the comfort of his tent and with the cushions that were around, it wasn't long before he nodded off to sleep. And in the morning, when he was awakened, gone was another blossom from the bush. So it happened that the second son was called to keep vigil. But he too took out the trappings from the palace to make himself comfortable, and he too fell asleep through the night, so that again in the morning another blossom was taken. So it came to the third son to keep the vigil. So the third son slashed himself and rubbed salt into his wound, and then he went to keep vigil by the bush. But of course, every time his eyes went to close, the burning of his wound kept him awake. And in the middle of the night, he heard the thump, thump, thump of something approaching. In the glow of the moon, he saw the most horrible creature that could be imagined in anyone's mind. An Afrit, they called it in these stories, an ogre we might call it. And overcoming his fear of this huge creature, he took out his sword and stabbed it, wounding it. But it turned and lumbered away. In the morning, they were able to follow the third prince and his brothers, follow the trail of blood from this monster, which took them to an unused well. Well, the first and eldest brother said, "It is my duty to go down the well." So a rope was lowered down, but he hadn't got but halfway down when he called out, pull me up, quickly, save me." He had seen his own shadow on the walls of the well and took fright, so they pulled him up. The second prince was lowered down, and he hadn't been gone more than a few moments in his descent when he too called out, pull up the rope, bring me up. His sword had scraped at the sides of the well with such a clang and a scream that he too had taken fright and was pulled up. The third prince, it was then his duty and turn to go down the well. And he said, "If I yell out to be saved, let out more rope." So the third prince was lowered over the side of the well, and he descended and descended and descended until he reached the bottom, to find that the well had gone dry. But before him there was an opening, and he went to follow that opening. And when he did, he heard a terrible sound of rumbling in the distance. But he followed the sound until he came to a door. It was obvious that behind that door was where the great rumbling and shaking was coming from. When he opened the door, there before him was a couch on which sat the most beautiful being he had ever imagined in all his dreaming, a maiden so fair that he had to blink his eyes at her beauty. Around her neck were the blossoms from the bush that had been gathered. But on her knees lay the head of the monstrous creature that had stolen the blossoms. The beautiful being pointed to a sword that lay nearby, covered with blood, to indicate that this was the sword of this monster. But the prince, being who he was not about to slay his enemy while it was asleep. So he awoke the beast, and then with one swipe of his sword, he lopped its head. The beautiful maiden told her story, and we can imagine what that story was. A princess of a realm taken by this creature of the depths. But here they were at the bottom of the well. What were they to do? How were they to escape? But surprisingly, just then, just outside, there appeared an old man with a long beard, and he said, "Your freedom will come when the rams fight." Then the old man disappeared, and in his place 2 rams, black and white, came together in a fight, their horns locking. The prince, standing aside, without a thought, went and grabbed the horns of the white ram, freeing it, and he placed the maiden on the ram's back. The ram immediately made an ascent, taking with it the maiden on its back. The maiden and the ram came out of the opening to the well, where the other princes were waiting, and of course when they saw her beauty, they were smitten, and immediately took her back to the palace, intending that one of them would marry her. The king asked, "Where is my son?" And the princes said that he was still down the well. And the king immediately went into mourning, saying that nothing would happen for 1 year, no weddings, no festivities. The whole country would be in mourning for his son. In the meantime, down in the well, the prince was left with the black ram. So there was nothing else for him to do but climb on its back. But instead of ascending, it descended. It descended down through the 7 layers of the earth, taking the prince with it, until the prince found himself in a place so dark, so dense, so overpowering, that his fear was great, almost greater than the courage he'd shown. But a great fatigue took over him. So in the dim light that began to appear around him, he saw a tree. So he lay down beneath the tree and went to sleep. But during his sleep, he heard great screeching sounds that woke him up. And when he looked up, he saw a nest, the nest of one of those great griffin birds, huge, majestic, violent, carrion eaters as they are. In the nest was a group of fledgling griffins, and when the prince climbed, he saw a venomous snake, its tongue flicking in and out, ready to strike, to take the fledglings. So taking his sword, he struck off the head of the viper, and then he cut it into pieces to feed to the fledgling birds. He then went back to sleep. In the meantime, the mother griffin came back to her nest, and seeing the sleeping prince beneath, immediately had fear for the life of her fledglings, and took a great boulder and was about to drop it on him, when the little fledgling birds flapped their hardly developed wings and protected him. And then it was that the great griffin saw the remnants of the snake in the nest and realized what had happened, and had the thought, how could I have initiated an evil act in the face of such an act of goodness? So the griffin bird said to the prince, I owe you the life of my fledglings. What can I do in return? And the prince, of course, said, I would like to return to the people of my kingdom. Ah, said the griffin, this that you ask of me is almost as great as asking me to sacrifice the life of my fledglings. But since I have promised, I have to fulfill this promise to you. Now, it was known that to traverse the 7 dimensions of the earth, the griffin bird had to have food to take it through and give it the energy to traverse each of these dimensions. So the prince went and he killed 7 sheep. And with the 7 sheep, he sat on the back of the griffin. And as they came to the top of each of Earth's dimensions, the prince fed a sheep to the griffin. When they were about to enter the 7th dimension, 7 sheep fell from the hands of the prince, and the griffin's energy was flagging. How could she make this last ascent without the sustenance? So the prince took his sword and cut off his right leg and gave it to the griffin bird. The griffin bird immediately smelt the blood and recognized what the prince had done. So carefully holding the leg in her mouth, gathering the last of her strength, she traversed through the last realm of Earth's dimensions and brought the prince back to his palace. The griffin bird licked the wound of the prince and told him that if he placed his severed leg against the wound, that his leg would be restored. And so it was. The griffin bird left to make her descent again, and the prince, with great rejoicing, was welcomed by the king. The two elder princes, feeling ashamed, left the kingdom. And of course, we know the end of the story. The prince, with great celebration, married the extraordinarily beautiful being, and the celebrations went on for 40 days and 40 nights. When we hear this allegory, folktale, fairy tale, knowing, sensing, feeling, experiencing that it combines and demonstrates the unifying of the three levels of life: existence, knowledge, bliss, karma, magic, the occult, and interrelatedness, nature, coming together seamlessly. What is it that arises for you? A question? An understanding? An answer? What is it that comes up for you out of this story?